Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel, Alicia. As you just saw in that video, which is up on TikTok, and that TikTok is linked down below. I'm finally reading Babel by R.F. Kuang, and I'm honestly a bit nervous about this book because I follow a couple of bookish content creators here on YouTube or on TikTok or Instagram, and I seem to have similar tastes to them, and those bookish content creators are a mixed bag of either they loved it or they hated it, and one of my really close friends read this and hated it, but we'll see how I like it because my friend said that I might actually enjoy this, so hopefully I do. Let's talk real quick about the other two books that I'm currently reading, but I'm not focusing on in this reading vlog. First up is The Girl in His Shadow by Audrey Blake. This is an 1840s historical fiction novel, and basically follows a young girl who's an assistant to a doctor after she loses her parents, and it is a crime if women are caught practicing medicine, but he still keeps her on. There's that story. I'm really looking forward to this one. I'm not that far into it, but I'm really looking forward to continuing it. It does seem promising so far though. And then the nonfiction book I'm reading is River of the Gods, Genius, Courage, and Betrayal in the Search for the Source of the Nile by Candice Millard. As you can tell from the title, it is about the three men who discovered the source of the Nile and their journey to get to that source. I am enjoying this book. I'm a little over halfway through. There are parts where it kind of feels like it lags a little bit, but it is a good read, I think. And if you're interested in like British Empire history and where exactly they were, this might be a good read for you. It's not exactly British Empire, but it's British Empire related and kind of set in 19th and 20th centuries. So if you're interested in that, give this a read. I do want to say that the books I've talked about, The Girl in the Shadow, Babel, and River of the Gods, are not going to be for everyone. If you think any of these books are interesting, feel free to pick them up and try to read them, but I'm not guaranteeing that you'll like them. Moving on to Babel. How do you say this title? I know I just said it Babel, I'm pretty sure. I go back and forth between Babel and Babel. How do y'all say it? Because I've heard both. I'm going to read the inner flap description of Babel just so you all get a sense of what this book is about. You're kind of getting this journey along with me. So here we go. I'm not going to try to read the Latin. An act of translation is always an act of betrayal. 1828, Robin Swift, orphaned by cholera in Canton, is brought to London by the mysterious Professor Lovell. There, Robin trains for years in Latin, ancient Greek, and Chinese, all in preparation for the day he'll enroll in Oxford University's prestigious Royal Institute of Translation, also known as Babel. Can powerful institutions be changed from within, or does revolution always require violence? Oh, that crack was nice. I'm going to take the dust jacket off real quick. I'm also going to read the author's note because, as I said, you're on this journey with me. Author's note on her representations of historical England and the University of Oxford in particular. The trouble with writing an Oxford novel is that anyone who has spent time at Oxford will scrutinize your text to determine if your representation of Oxford aligns with their own memories of the place. Worse, if you are an American writing about Oxford. For what do Americans know about anything? I offer my defense here. Babel is a work of speculative fiction and so takes place in a fantastical version of Oxford in the 1830s, whose history was thoroughly altered by silver work. Still, I try to remain as faithful to the historical record on life in the early Victorian Oxford as possible, and to introduce falsehoods only when they serve the narrative. That's all I'm gonna read, but can we just appreciate the hardback of this, how it kind of matches the dust jacket and it's coloring like the black and yellow. Can we appreciate that? I do take off my dust jackets when I'm reading hardbacks, but not everyone does that, and that's okay. That's all the on-camera reading I'm going to do for this video, just because I simply like giving updates, and I tend to read right before bed, and lighting is not always great right before bed for me, so I'm just going to give as regular updates as I can for this book. So I'll see you in the first update. Very tiny update for Babel. I've only read chapter 1. I have included a couple of post-its throughout the book. I'm using these post-its. Once I run out of this color, I'll show you what I'll use next. But I'm basically using these post-its with the dots, things that stick out to me, things I have questions about. And then from this set specifically, I'm using this red color to note when there's a footnote in the book. Because I remember that being a big complaint for a lot of people, where it was the footnotes in general or too many footnotes. There's 2 tabs sticking out that are the red color, and that means that there's a footnote on that page, and so far there's only been 2 in chapter 1. And then once I finish reading, I'm going to count how many tabs there were and kind of see how I feel about the number of footnotes. But right now these footnotes kind of feel unnecessary, like the 2 that we've gotten. Like the first one is talking about chapter 7 of book 4 of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. If this were a history book, then I would be like, okay, yes, include footnotes, include descriptory, explanatory footnotes, but for a fantasy book, that doesn't feel necessary. The second footnote is like, it basically says like, I killed a cock robin who saw me. Right now, it's a minor annoyance of what's the point. Right now, it's only 2. Not a big deal. Hopefully not a big deal in the future. I'm not entirely sure what it is Professor Lovell is giving Robin. Maybe like the silver stuff. Yeah, the silver bar. It helps them feel better. Okay, magic system. Silver helps people feel better, which is why it's valuable. It also helps people with knowledge, if I'm understanding like the synopsis correctly. But like apparently it tastes different every time you use it to heal someone, and it's like, okay, treacle kind of makes sense, but why does it taste differently every single time? As I said, the first time is treacle, second time is dates, I think. I'm a little bit confused by that, but we're gonna be okay. I'm recording this early in the day, which is why it's so bright. First up, I finished the other post-it sheet that I had, so I moved fully to this one, and again, I'm using this post-it on top for noting where footnotes are, and then I'm just starting with this color for just parts I want to remember, quotes, things that I have questions about, and then I'll move on from there. I really had no intention of updating every chapter. I still don't intend to do that, but right now, it seems like that's what's going to happen for a little bit. Hopefully this is the last time I update one chapter at a time, and hopefully my next update is a couple of chapters after this. I'm partway through chapter 3. I haven't quite finished it, but I wanted to update about chapter 2 because I have some thoughts, and I wanted to share these thoughts before I forgot to share them, or before I forgot what exactly I wanted to talk about within these 2 chapters, or within the chapter and a half I've read, chapter 2 and then partway through chapter 3. As I said, I have some tabs going about quotes I might want to use in my review. On Goodreads and Storygraph, I start out my reviews with a quote, so I'm having any quotes that I might want to use there be tabbed, and then the tab extending on the page for a little bit. Otherwise, the tabs are like this, where they don't extend past the page. And in chapter 1, there were 2 footnotes, as I think I talked about earlier in the video. Not a huge deal. In chapter 2, there were 8 pages that had footnotes, and a couple of those pages had 2 to 3 footnotes. And where I'm at in chapter 3 so far, there have been 2 pages that have had footnotes. So right now, where I am in the book, there have been a total of 10 pages that have had footnotes. At this point, it is kind of getting annoying, and like every time you see that little section of the footnotes where you have like a little bit of an explanation, it does take you out of the story. A part of me understands why she did this. As someone who has their BA in history, as someone who's had to write multiple papers in history, footnotes are a very useful thing. But when you are writing something that is a work of fiction, that is a novel and not a non-fiction book, footnotes aren't necessarily needed for a fiction, for a fantasy book, which is what this is. Yes, it is heavily based in history. It's a historical fantasy novel, but just because it is a historical fiction book doesn't make it any less fiction, and it doesn't make it any less fantasy. And if she wanted to make this feel more historical, so to say, and like more like a history book alongside being a fantasy book, a fantasy fiction book, she could have had those footnotes be endnotes, which are basically very similar things, but endnotes are at the end of a paper or at the end of a book, a non-fiction book, a history book. So she could have done endnotes and organized it by chapter. You can see right here, some of these tabs are quotes and not necessarily footnotes. But you can see right here, it's like quite a few footnotes in a very small section of the book, only like 2.5 chapters. It is starting to get annoying, and I'm only 2.5 chapters in. Moving to the story now, I'm not going to talk about chapter 3 too much just because I am halfway through it. I am finding myself liking the story so far. I feel like Kuang has really written the situation very well, Robin's situation very well. I do think that so far it is starting off very strong. I do feel like there are a couple parts that drag on a little bit, unnecessarily drag on. This book is 542 pages, not including the author's note or the acknowledgements. And even right now, I do feel like this book could have been cut short. Maybe, I would say like right now, at least, I would say it could have been cut short around 25 to 50 pages because, as I said, like some of these scenes in chapters 1 and 2 are lagging a little bit. And it's not that I find these parts that are lagging to be bad, it just doesn't feel like it's a necessary lull in the story. And these lulls in the story, these lagging parts, don't feel like they're adding much to the story. Those are my thoughts so far. I'll see you in the next update. We'll see how it goes. And we'll see if I get any more annoyed at the footnotes. Before I start talking about this, I do want to say sorry that I sound a bit congested right now, but moving on. I wanted to talk about this because today, April 21st, some drama came out about a BookToker who was actually one of my mutuals, and basically the premise of the video she posted was that she wanted to talk about books by authors who were problematic, specifically Sarah J. Maas, SJM, and Colleen Hoover, Coho, because those books, the A Court of Thorn and Roses series, and then some of Colleen Hoover's books, had gotten her out of a reading slump. A lot of bookish content creators did react to this over on BookTok, but I wanted to discuss it in this video. First and foremost, if you have read an author and you did not know that they were problematic before you read their book, that is fine. In today's day and age, it is a little bit of a slippery slope to not know that certain authors are problematic, especially authors like SJM and Coho. But the minute you hear that an author is problematic from a bookish content creator in a marginalized community like the BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ communities, if you stumble upon a video on TikTok or a post on Instagram or Facebook or wherever and they're saying that an author is problematic, immediately drop what you're reading from that author, stop reading that author, and do research into that author, why they're problematic, what their books are about, what posts they have made on social media, etc., so on and so forth. But the minute you see a person say, this author is problematic because of XYZ, immediately drop the book you're reading from that author. Because it is as simple as typing in the author's name and then problematic or controversy, or a book title's name and then problematic or controversy. It is as simple as doing that in a search engine. And the thing is that when bookish content creators who are part of minority groups, part of marginalized groups, are telling you that an author is problematic for whatever reason, they're just asking that you stop supporting that author. They're simply asking that you don't buy that author's books, that you don't buy merchandise related to that author's books, that you don't go see movie adaptations or don't watch cinema adaptations, whether it's a movie or TV show, because they are problematic. And the thing is, bookish content creators who have called out problematic authors, they're not saying that you're in the wrong for loving that book when you did, loving that author's books when you did, before you found out that that author was problematic. It's what you do after you find out that the author is problematic. Do you continue reading their books? Do you continue supporting them? Do you continue talking about that author and their books on your social media platforms? And if you do, that is what the issue is. If you learn about how that author's problematic and then you stop supporting them, you don't buy any more of their books, not buying merchandise related to their books, by not talking about their books on social media, that is the right decision to make. But if you continue to support that author, that is the issue that a lot of bookish content creators have. I wanted to give an update to Babel since I finished book 1 and I'm about to start book 2. Also, I did switch bookmarks to a book of the month bookmark, and this one says, I'm a great judge of characters. I felt this was fitting for this book. I've decided that since there are 5 books, 5 parts to Babel, I'm going to update as I finish each part. And then once I finish book 5, the final part, then I'll give an overall update and my overall thoughts. Now that I finished book 1, part 1, you can see here I have quotes that I might want to use in my review, and then down here are some more quotes, and then also the footnotes. The footnotes are really starting to get annoying. Not only am I keeping track of them using the tabs, but I'm also trying to keep track of them on this post-it note here. And in the first 4 chapters within book 1, there were 18 pages in total that had footnotes. Quite a few of those pages, if not most of those pages, had 2 or more footnotes that were 1 to 2 paragraphs long. I think I talked about this earlier, but I can kind of understand where Kuang is coming from in wanting to include footnotes in a historical fiction book, especially one like Babel, which is so focused on learning and language and the history of language. And the language department at Babel and Oxford focuses a lot on ancient languages, just because I guess they want to catch up with translating all the ancient languages before they start at least focusing more heavily on modern languages. I'm And plus, too, the subtitle for this book is An Arcane History, even though it's fiction. As I said, I could kind of understand why Kuang felt like she wanted to or needed to include footnotes in this, but as I think I also said, this could have very easily been endnote, because when you're reading this, like, all of a sudden you're jolted out of the story when you see a footnote saying like, oh, Robin wasn't that interested in this author's books, or just random footnotes like, I killed a cock robin who saw him die. There are some really helpful footnotes in the sense that we do get some translations for certain words or what specific Chinese words mean, and then there are some other semi-helpful footnotes in the sense that certain books and certain quotes from books, from real books, are explained in a little further detail, and then you get some really unhelpful, pointless footnotes like the one I mentioned earlier where it says, I killed a cock robin who saw him die. It's like, what was the point of that footnote? But the whole point of that was that there are 18 pages in total that have at least one footnote, if not more, and I would say maybe 5 of the footnotes in total were semi-helpful, but I'm not fully reading these footnotes. I'm just keeping track of them because I just want to continue on with the story, and having these footnotes on the page really brings you out of the story, and it's not something that I want to read. And as I said, I'm just keeping track of them. At most, I'll maybe read the first phrase until I hit a comma, or if it's a very short first sentence of the footnote, that's all I'll read as I'm tabbing them. At this rate, there are going to be a lot of pages with footnotes, and I'm going to take a guess that it might be close to 100. And as I started saying, all of these could have been endnotes in the sense that they're at the end of the book. It could have very easily been that without necessarily using any commentary that Kuang wanted to include. It didn't have to be footnotes. And the thing is, a lot of the little asterisks, or I'm not sure what the other symbol is called for footnotes, when you have more than one footnote on a page, a lot of these symbols are really hard to notice at first, and I'm like, oh, there's a footnote, and then it's like, wait, where was the footnote? Where was the asterisk for the footnote? And then I'm scanning through the page multiple times over and over again until I see it, and I'm like, okay, that took away 5 minutes of my life that I could have spent reading the book instead of trying to find the footnote. So I would say the footnotes, the symbols for the footnotes on the page itself could be a little bit more obvious, and the footnotes themselves could have been made into endnotes. Moving on to the story, I do feel like I'm enjoying it so far, but at the same time, I do still feel that this can be cut down maybe around 50 to 100 pages roughly. There are quite a few parts that are dragging a little too much, and a lot of scenes are lulling, and these dragging on scenes, these lulling scenes, don't feel very well paced within the story. But I do feel that this book is a very good commentary on the dangers of colonialism, on the dangers of the British Empire, and the dangers that those things had, especially on indigenous cultures and indigenous peoples, of non-white cultures, of non-Eurocentric cultures. So I feel like this is a really good story in that sense, and I was going into this book kind of expecting it to be dry because, you know, subtitle and arcane history. Because it's fiction, I was expecting this weird hodgepodge of trying to come off as historical while being a fiction book and trying to meld this historical concept with a fantastical world, but set in a place that's very much real. I think this book is doing a good job at melding the concepts of history nonfiction books into fiction and into fantasy, and also melding fiction fantasy concepts into a real place, a real world. Because for me, I always have a little bit of trouble with urban fantasies, because for me, they never really follow through with the concept of being a fantasy, where it just feels a little too familiar. The magic system isn't fleshed out enough, or the magic system is there, but it's there for the sake of being there rather than adding anything to the story. And I was kind of expecting something like that for Babel, where you had a magic system because it's fantasy set in an urban setting and a real place, but this really delivers on having the magic setting, on having a fantastical setting, of having a magic system, and having a magic system that is used but subtle. Because in a lot of cases too, where you have a magic system that's at work in an urban fantasy, as I was saying earlier, either it's there just for the sake of being there, or it's overused and too cliche and too tropey for a magic system. system, and both of those things just end up turning me off of urban fantasy style books, whereas this one does it well. As I said, it's very subtle in this, like, you know it's there and you're seeing it in use, but you're not necessarily being beat over the head with the magic system. You're not necessarily beating a dead horse, so to say, with the magic system. You know it's there, you see it's there, and you see it at work, and you get little explanations here and there as to what it does, but you're not being inundated with the magic system, and at the same time you're not necessarily being left in the dark as to why the magic system's there. It's that nice middle ground. This is my next update in Babel by R.F. Kuang, and I am about to start part 3, book 3, chapter 13, and here are my thoughts about part 2 and about the story in general that we have so far between books 1 and 2. As I said in my last update, I am finding the story very interesting and intriguing, and this is a good commentary on the negatives of colonialism, of empire, and I think this is a good book in that sense. I'm waiting for the plot to really pick up because so far it is still kind of this lull where at the beginning we have Professor Lovell, where at the beginning of the book we have Professor Lovell picking up Robin from Canton after Robin's family died from cholera, and Professor Lovell brought Robin to England. After some learning, Robin enrolled in Oxford, specifically the linguistic department in Babel, and we're just kind of going through the motions of Robin attending school. That itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, and I understand the whole concept of showing versus telling, which I appreciate. But at the same time, a lot of this can be cut out because at this point I am kind of just wanting to get into the nitty-gritty of the story, the meat of the story, and a lot of it is just the same thing, just washed down, rinsed and repeated, where it's Robin's going to classes, Robin's meeting up with Griffin, Robin's doing X, Y, and Z with his friends. So it's a lot of things where it's like the same kind of mini structure within the overall structure of the book of what exactly Robin's doing. So that's why I feel like a lot of this could be cut down. This is where I'm at in the book. I'm almost halfway through. Right now it is sitting around 3 stars for me. I would say maybe 2.5 to 3 stars. Even though I don't think this is necessarily a bad book, it could be cut down significantly, and part of me would expect a little bit more action, and a little bit more action that has bigger consequences, if that makes sense. I don't want to get too much more into detail because then I feel like I'll start getting into spoiler territory. So let's talk about the footnotes. There are a lot. I would say 1 or 2 of these are quotes, but most of these are the footnotes. And I did have to change color for the footnotes because I did run out of the red color, and I also ran out of the yellowish color that I was using, so I'm going to have to move on to another color. In book 2, there were 22 pages that had footnotes on them, at least 1 footnote, sometimes 2, and in a lot of cases these footnotes had at least 1 paragraph, 1 chunky paragraph instead of 1 or 2 sentences. And that is in comparison to the 18 pages that we got in book 1 that had footnotes. 18 versus 22. There's 40 pages in total that had footnotes, and that's 40 pages of 219 pages if we're just looking at books 1 and 2. It's not a huge number, but it is a large enough number that it's significant. I'm not going to rehash my feelings about the footnotes aside from the fact that they are feeling really insignificant and they don't necessarily need to be paragraphs long, because the footnotes that are maybe like 1 line long, 1 sentence long, or maybe even are just 1 to 2 Chinese characters, those ones are fine. Once once it starts hitting like 2 or more lines, then that's when it starts really becoming jarring for the story, in my opinion. Even more so when it's the big paragraphs, and even though the text itself for footnotes is small, it's still kind of jarring to have like a paragraph of small text of footnotes that refers back to one word or one small phrase. And it's like, why do we need all this extra detail? First off, and second off, why couldn't this have been included in the book itself? And if it was edited out of the book by Kuang's editor, why was this included in the footnotes? And as I was kind of talking about, why were these not endnotes if Kuang really felt that these were necessary? One other update, semi-related, at the beginning of this video, I said that I was reading 2 other books at the same time as this one, and those 2 books were The Girl in the Shadow and River of the Gods, and I wanted to talk about them a little bit. So first off, River of the Gods, I finished it. I really enjoyed it. There were some parts that I felt dragged a little bit or a little bit too long, too unnecessary, but overall I did enjoy it, and I think it's a really good read to delve into. And then with The Girl in the Shadow, I was finding it interesting, but I had to put it down because the main character in The Girl in the Shadow, Nora, I think her name was, Eleanor, she had a very similar history, not exactly the same to Robin, but a very similar history to Robin. Both had parents, families who died of cholera and were brought in by someone in an academic position, and they both started learning under that subject that their foster parent, that their adoptive parent, so to say, works in. With Professor Lovell, it's linguistics and language. With the doctor who took Eleanor in, it's surgery. And because of that, I didn't want to get the 2 stories mixed up, so I set The Girl in the Shadow down, and I'm hoping to return to it at some point soon. When You Wish Upon a Star by Elizabeth Lim just arrived in the mail today, and I'm super happy with it. It is the most recent installment of the Disney Twisted Tales series, and I absolutely love this cover. I will say that the main reason why I bought this is because of the author, Elizabeth Lim. She wrote the 6 Crimson Cranes duology, which I absolutely love. If this was any other author, I probably would not have bought this book because I'm not the biggest Pinocchio fan. I don't really like Pinocchio. I can't really say that I hate Pinocchio, but it's just not my jam. So if it was any other author aside from Elizabeth Lim, I probably would not have bought this. I'm really looking forward to reading this. I'm gonna try to hold off on reading this for a little while. That way I can try to get to some of my other physical books on my TBR before this one, but we'll see. So I am about to start book 4, part 4 of Babel, and here are my thoughts so far. To get it out of the way, because I'm going to mention this every single time, every single update, there are too many footnotes in this book for a fiction book. At the very least, as I believe I've said in earlier updates, if Kuang felt like it was necessary to include the footnotes, to include the little additions, but they weren't necessarily needed for the story itself, it could have been endnotes at the end of the book in like a little section, endnote, or additional information, additional notes. It did not have to be footnotes. 90% of the tabs down here are footnotes, and that is way too many. And I'm still keeping note about how many pages have footnotes. At first I was going to try to keep track of how many footnotes in total there were, but at this point it's easier to keep track of how many pages have footnotes, because many of these pages have 2 or more footnotes, and many of them also have footnotes that are at least a paragraph long, which is insane for a fiction book. Within the first 3 books, within the first 3 parts of Babel, there have been 64 out of 323 pages that have had footnotes. That's insane. Like, yeah, 64 out of 323 is not a big number, it's not even a third, but 64 out of 239 pages is still a big enough page number that it's noticeable. As I said, 90%, if not 99% of these tabs at the bottom. And for 64 pages to have 1 or more footnotes is kind of insane, as I said, especially when you have a fiction book. If this was a non-fiction book, I wouldn't be making this big of a deal about it, but it's not non-fiction, it's fiction. I'm not necessarily reading it for any additional information, and when you have a fiction book, it's expected that whatever is needed in the story is on the page itself, and that you don't need these little additions of footnotes or even endnotes to add to the story. And as I've said in earlier updates, a lot of these footnotes are kind of pointless. Most of the time I'm just tabbing it with a post-it tab and moving on, because I'm not going to spend more time reading about it, because what is needed should be on the page itself without the footnotes. Okay, let's talk about the plot of this book a little bit, just to have something other than complaining about the footnotes. I'm a little bit over halfway through this book. This is what I've read. This is what I need to read. And at this point, I was kind of expecting the plot to have picked up a little bit more. There is stuff going on, but it's like nothing really major has happened so far. Nothing big is really going on. And in some cases, that kind of makes sense, because if you have a secret society like Hermes, they're not going to be making their plans, their notions obvious. But at the same time, when you're 3 books and 3 parts into the story, you kind of expect a little bit more from the secret society, a little bit more action from them, and more attempts to undermine the big corporation-like structure. In Babel's case, Babel, Oxford. I was kind of expecting more at this point in the book, but nothing's really going on. Like, you have a bunch of little moments. That's about it. You don't really have anything big. You don't really have a big catalyst that really spurs anybody on. So for me, this book isn't doing what it needed to do. It's not giving anything for me. It's not what I was expecting it to be. I can't say that I'm necessarily disappointed. It definitely is an overhyped book in my opinion. Although I can understand why people like this book, why people enjoyed it. It's just, with a book like this and a premise like this, I was expecting something a little bit more, or at least more perspectives from the Hermes Society, people within the Hermes Society, instead of just looking at Babel. I feel like if we had a story like that, like still named Babel, still the same premise, but from the perspective of the Hermes Society, that would have made for a far more interesting book in my opinion. At this point, I am kind of considering DNFing this book. I'm going to try to get through a couple more chapters at least, just to kind of see if anything happens in book 4 that like makes me think like, oh, I need to continue, I need to finish this book. But if it's kind of like same old, then I'm going to DNF this book. So I'll give you guys my next update when it happens, whether I DNF it or continue it. I'll see you on the other side. I just recorded my most recent update for Babel like maybe 30 minutes ago, where I was saying I finished part 3 and that I was gonna try to read a little bit more into book 4 and then decide if I was gonna continue it or DNF it. However, at this point, I think I'm just gonna DNF it. I did try reading a little bit into book 4. I read like 2 chapters and I just still wasn't feeling it. If I were to rate this, I would probably give it 2.5, 2.75 stars. What I read wasn't necessarily bad. I enjoyed parts of it. I enjoyed the concept of it. I just don't think that the execution was good, and I just don't think that this book was for me, so I'm just gonna leave it here, not force myself to read anymore, especially when I'm not really feeling it, and I can move on to other books on my bookshelf that are waiting for me. Thank you all for watching, and stay tuned for my next video.